Good afternoon, everyone. A piece of mail. What could it mean? It could mean an invitation, perhaps. It could mean a sales event, perhaps. Usually it means a bill. But who would expect a misplaced piece of mail to lead to a great friendship? Let me explain. Way back when the year numbers started with 19, in 1999, we had recently moved to our new condo at Cadeau Terrace. We were Unit 6. Not long after we moved in, we received this piece of mail in our mailbox that didn't belong to us. After a couple of failed attempts to deliver it to a Don and Lynn Cunningham in Unit 4, we noticed some lights on in the condo one evening. So I suited up on this very cold February snowy night and headed just 2 doors down, knocked on the door, and was introduced to the owner, Mr. Don Cunningham. I gave him the envelope. He explained that he was only home for a couple of days on business and would be returning to Phoenix, where his wife Lynn and he were spending the winter. So we agreed that when they got back and settled in the spring, that the 4 of us should get together and get to know each other, get to know our neighbors. And we did just that. And that friendship evolved from that day. There was kind of a multifaceted friendship to this foursome, I would say. Harold and my late husband is my late husband, and Don, who would golf and laugh and drink, and I don't know what else they did, and I may not want to know. Lynn and I, Harold and Lynn, and the 4 of us, of course. I remember snippets of that first rum and coke gathering when we discovered that both couples had recently been married for the 2nd time, and in fact our weddings had only been a couple of months apart. We learned that 3 of the 4 of them golfed, and they let me be part of the group anyway, thankfully. We learned that Harold and Lynn already had grandchildren. We learned that Don and Lynn had moved to London from an area that I'd spent many of my summers as a kid boating. Through the course of that first visit, we also learned that Lynn and Harold shared a very difficult but special, Harold used to say, membership in a club, that being the loss of one of their 3 children, each of them having lost a son, both of them just 17 years old. Needless to say, Lynn and Harold formed a very special relationship that thankfully few of us can really understand. And there were plenty of laughs during that first visit, if I remember correctly. Some of them involved their little dog Cricket trying to get cheese off of the table. And Cricket would follow us around through many vacations after that. Not long after that first visit, we met Don and Lynn at, I think it was one of their timeshares, and I think it was in one of the Carolinas. Those facts don't really matter, but that week was when Lynn and I really started to connect as good friends. We shopped. She stayed behind to spend time with me while the guys golfed, and I know she would love to have been out on the golf course. But we shopped and we cooked and we talked. Our friendship often took a fairly serious nature to it. Me often trying to figure out how she dealt so well with the hand that she'd been given with regard to the loss of Tyler, and me, through her, trying to figure out how to help Harold deal with his loss a little easier. We talked about our kids, her grandkids, about our husbands and how they drove us crazy sometimes, all the girlfriend things. I'd never known anyone or met anyone quite like Lynn at that point. She had like a broad and wise awareness of people, always unassuming, always humble, and always very curious. I spent a week with Lynn in Phoenix after I retired from my career. Don and Harold were both still working. Harold and I had been living in Michigan for a while at that point. So Lynn and I hadn't seen each other for a while, and we weren't the kind of friends that talked every week or every month even sometimes. And in this particular case, it had been a while since we'd seen each other. But it didn't matter. It was instant. The minute we'd get back together, we just picked up where we left off. Her often asking questions about things that I'd almost forgotten about. She had a great memory, and she was always really, truly interested in your story. During that trip, she and I drove out to Sedona to spend the day. We hiked around a little bit and finally found a nice quiet spot to sit and just look at the grandeur. And like so many people do, Lynn mentioned to me that she found this place particularly spiritual, and that she felt really close to Tyler whenever she went out there. She mentioned to me on the way back to their fifth wheel, she said, you know, I think it would help Harold if he could find a way to feel closer to Jeffrey instead of always feeling the absence. And I said, Lynn, you may be right, but I know that's advice he won't take from me. That's all we said. Didn't say anything more about it. But not too long after that, this Oklahoma heat-loving raised boy started winter hiking. And I have to tell you, he hated winter and he hated the cold. But he would suit up and head out on the snowiest, coldest Sunday when he could and be gone for hours. And when he'd come back, there'd always be this quiet peace about him. And I knew that Lynn had spoken with him and he had taken her very sage advice. And when I faced my own terrifying prospect of possibly losing a daughter, and we just kept getting bad news after bad news, she held me one day as I sobbed with grief and rage and fear. She took my hand, which for Lynn was a little bit unusual. Lynn was not an overly tactile or touchy-feely kind of person, but I remember that feeling to this moment, her resting her hand on top of mine until I calmed down a little bit. And I looked at her and I said, how do I prepare for this? I don't know how to do this. And she said, you don't. You don't prepare for it. You shouldn't prepare for it. You need to live and celebrate every single moment that you have with her. Those are words we all know, those are thoughts we all know, but she knew I needed to hear that at that moment. And thankfully, we are still celebrating times together, and I thank you. The four of us spent a week touring Lake Powell in Utah in a very small houseboat. Talk about getting to know people for a whole week in a very small houseboat where there's really no marinas, there was no stores, no shopping. It was you anchor for the night or you drive up onto the sand. It was just the four of us for the week, and a houseboat and a little dinghy. Dawn, you're shaking your head. I know you're thinking, I know what you're thinking, and if I tell you everything that happened during that week, I'd have to kill you. It was a fantastic week, so many memories, and all I remember most of all is laughter, just laughter after laughter all week. And for years after that, when the four of us would get together, we would talk about that trip, and we would all agree that it was one of the best vacations any of us had ever had in our lives. I'll never forget it, and it was a really special time. But I don't want to have to kill you, so I won't tell you anymore. Years later, of course, Lynn faced her diagnosis with such bravery and the word you used, grace. It comes to mind, obviously, to anybody who knew her well. She had faced many of life's challenges, and she'd done it the same way, with this strength and grace and determination. I remember asking her once, how do you do it? She said, well, it's not like I have a choice. And as I was preparing for today, I thought, yeah, you did have a choice. You could have been bitter, and you could have been angry, and you could have quit living or quit inviting people into your life, but you didn't. You were strong, you were graceful, you were humble, and you continued to live life to the fullest, just as long as you possibly could. After Lynn went into McCormick, she and I probably spent more time together than we really ever had. The COVID restrictions had lifted, Harold had passed away, and I was able to see her frequently. At first, while she was still well enough, we'd hike out in my car, go for lunch fairly often, or we just drive around and play 60s music and sing at the top of our lungs in the car with the seatbelt done up, but she would giggle because I called it bum dancing. I'd say, okay, Lynn, we're gonna bum dance. So we'd be driving around in the car, seatbelt on, singing at the top of our lungs and wiggling around in the seat. And I have to tell you, she remembered the words to those songs long after her memory started to fail. And when we couldn't go out anymore because it just became too difficult, we would bum dance and sing at the top of our lungs in her room in McCormick, in the home, which she would later call the hotel. While I focused on a lot of Lynn's more serious nature, she really did have a wicked sense of humor as well. And as she changed through the progression of her illness, that sense of humor just got wittier and wittier, and there were times when she would often literally just right out of the blue make me laugh out loud. And I know she did that with some of the staff, and I know some of the staff of McCormick are here today, which is wonderful. I miss her. We all miss her. We've missed her for a while now. Don and Tracy and family, my condolences for your loss. I know that this has been happening for a while, but it feels different now. I also want to thank you for allowing me to honor her and celebrate her life with you here today. She truly had a lasting effect on my life and how I look at it, just as I'm sure she did to many or all of you here. I miss our warm, honest friendship. I miss her wit and her wisdom. I miss her cautious yet beautiful smile. And I miss her bountiful grace and her humble nature. And I will be forever grateful for a random, mishandled piece of mail. Thank you.